Soy el cofundador y presidente de Holberton School. Holberton es una alternativa a la universidad diseñada en Silicon Valley. Capacita ingenieros de software altamente calificados a gran escala. Con 13 campus en todo el mundo, nuestros graduados son contratados por las principales empresas de tecnología como Google, Tesla, Apple, Rappi y muchas más. Hoy me complace anunciar que nos hemos asociado con Buen Trip Hub para traer a Holberton School a Ecuador. Estamos impresionados con el ámbito tecnológico de Ecuador, con empresas y startups como Location World, Inspectorio, JobCity, Shipify y las 170 empresas tecnológicas afiliadas a Citec. Estamos orgullosos de formar parte de esta comunidad y de capacitar a ingenieros de software diversos con el nivel de Silicon Valley. Que tengan un muy buen día. Gracias.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Buenísimo. Con eso les quiero compartir que vamos a estar dándoles más información en las próximas semanas sobre la llegada de Holberton a Ecuador. Es un nuevo proyecto para Buen Trip que nos tiene emocionadísimos a todos y estoy segura empujará a todo el desarrollo del ecosistema tecnológico en el país hacia adelante muy, muy rápido. Como vimos ayer durante las conferencias, vimos que el tema de generar y capacitar a talento en tecnología es uno de los puntales más importantes para poder apoyar a los futuros emprendedores y a las empresas que están buscando crecer. Entonces, sin más, porque ya estamos un poco sobre el tiempo, quiero arrancar porque estoy segura que la primera conferencia de hoy, que tendrá un formato un poquito distinto, será una entrevista estilo fireside chat junto a Alex Lazarow, que es uno de los speakers que la verdad estamos encantados de tener hoy en el Opportunity Summit. Estoy seguro nos abrirá la cabeza a muchos. Fernando Rivera, uno de los co-founders de Buen Trip, será quien entreviste a Alex. Entonces, quiero darle la palabra a Fernando para que pueda arrancar este bloque del evento. Muchísimas gracias y bienvenidos a todos.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Carmen. Les recuerdo, por favor, antes de empezar, y los que necesiten, tenemos interpretación simultánea en español. Simplemente hagan clic abajo a la derecha donde dice Interpretation y escojan el canal Spanish, y ya que la charla va a ser en inglés. With that, Alex, so glad to have you here. I couldn't be more excited about sharing this time with you in our fireside chat. Alex is investment director at Cathay Innovation and author of a great book that I read earlier this year, Out Innovate. Out Innovate, when I read the book, I felt like somebody had taken all the ideas that I have around innovation, startups, ecosystems, and reorganized them in my mind. So in his book, Alex reveals the revolution that is taking place outside of the most developed startup ecosystems in the world, where entrepreneurs are already out innovating their counterparts in Silicon Valley. Welcome, Alex. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself briefly to the audience.
Yeah, happily. And thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. Apologies, my Spanish is not strong enough to do this live in Spanish. But yeah, so by day, as you were alluding to, I'm a venture capitalist. I have one foot living in Silicon Valley and another supporting entrepreneurs around the world, including in LATAM. And outside of work, I've been teaching entrepreneurship with the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. And both of those experiences had given me a little bit of the impetus for the book, which we'll talk about today. I was getting really frustrated. I always wanted to sign my students books on innovation and best practice, but invariably I found that the content was centered in a time and a place, Silicon Valley and today, and for a very particular type of asset-light software-based business that wants to grow extraordinarily fast and raise extraordinary amounts of venture capital money. And around the world, I think the best entrepreneurs operate in different ecosystems with less capital, with less resources, with less depth of trained, been there, done that, startup human capital, or that might face more macroeconomic shocks. And in those ecosystems, a different best practice is required. And I think that the best entrepreneur operating in Detroit or Amsterdam or Bangalore or Lima or wherever has more in common with the best entrepreneurs operating in Sao Paulo than they do with those in San Francisco. And yet no one's telling their stories. And so I interviewed about 200 entrepreneurs, mostly folks leading some of the biggest businesses across the emerging markets. And I think that taken together, their experience not only challenged Silicon Valley's conventional wisdoms, increasingly they reinvent startup best practice in some meaningful ways. And so that was the stories that I was excited to tell, and excited to have the conversation today.
Great, thank you. So with that, I mean, you mentioned, can you define for us what you mean by the frontier? I think you've alluded to it already, but it is part of the title of the book.
And in some ways, this is one of the tougher parts of writing the book, because it isn't as simple as saying there's Silicon Valley and not Silicon Valley. The whole world is incredibly heterogeneous itself. And so to make one massive oversimplification, what I've done in the book is I said, well, you know, there are ecosystems that operate in developed countries versus developing countries, and then developed startup ecosystems where there's kind of a lot of investors, corporates, what have you, and then kind of more nascent startup ecosystems. And so you might put Silicon Valley in the top right corner and maybe a handful of other ecosystems up there. In the book, I bring us as far as Pyongyang in North Korea, and you might say very developing country and very developing startup ecosystem, right? But also places like Lusaka or whatever in Zambia. And there I try to pull at the threads and really show the extreme differences that make the point. But I also try to bring us to places where the differences are more nuanced, right? In Bangalore, for instance, or you might say Sao Paulo, there's a pretty developed startup ecosystem operating in an emerging market. Versus, you know, my hometown, I grew up in the middle of Canada, and in Winnipeg, very developed country, very nascent startup ecosystem. And so the problems and the challenges that entrepreneurs face look different in different ecosystems. And so, so I try to pull at some of those threads as well.
Great, thank you. You allude to the difference between, well, Silicon Valley is looking to build unicorns, and you say outside of Silicon Valley, companies that thrive are camels.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean there?
Well, everyone in Silicon Valley needs an animal, and so I had to have one too, which is why we have the camel. But you know, what is the unicorn, right? It was a term that literally means $1 billion business. But it also comes with a lot of baggage, and that's the baggage that I'm trying to tackle in the book. And the baggage that comes around the term unicorn is the method of building big businesses. And the method is growth at all cost, where it's okay to have unsustainable unit economics in service of growth, where it's okay to have massive burn in service of growth, where it's okay to take a short-term lens in service of growth. And that approach works extraordinarily well within a context of a lot of venture capital and for a very specific set of winner-takes-all business models. But for the vast, vast majority of companies and for the vast, vast majority of the world, that approach doesn't make sense, right? Particularly when there's less resources. So the reason I talk about the camel, first, 2 fun facts about it. The camel in good times can sprint across the desert, can drink water faster than any other animal, can really take advantage of good situations, but also exists all over the planet, isn't an imaginary animal, and can survive the world's harshest environment. So that's kind of the reason for the analogy. And it's businesses that are rooted in sustainable unit economics and balanced growth and balanced burn and a long-term approach. And this doesn't mean, of course, that they don't want to grow. It just means that they grow from a foundation of strength. And that foundation of strength is sustainability and resilience from day one. And so that's what I talk about in the book around this theme of the camel. And maybe one more reflection on this point. If I was going to take a meta lens on the book, a lot of what I talk about is how conditions of adversity cause a shift in strategy, and that shift in strategy gives us an opportunity to have an advantage, an enduring advantage over the long term. And this is an example of less resources. It's obviously harder to build a startup, but off that foundation, you build something stronger and more long-term. And so that at least is the good news to the piece.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I remember in your book, you mentioned a few examples of companies that have grown tremendously, but not necessarily at the same pace. And some companies that after 7 years of, relative small growth, all of a sudden have found the right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any more examples.
Yeah, and first of all, I'm not advocating slow growth. I'm advocating more balanced growth. So a lot of the companies I tackle in the book are companies that have grown to be multi-billion-dollar businesses, but they've done it with this different philosophy in mind and different approach. And so I'll give you an example in 1 second, but maybe just to take a step back. Every startup has a valley of death, right? Like every startup will lose money at the beginning. They might not have revenue or product. They'll lose money, and then they'll keep burning cash, and eventually the revenue curve will continue going up, and so the cash burn curve will come back, right? So every company has this like valley of death dynamic, and you try to get out the other side. In Silicon Valley, the thesis is, well, we'll raise a lot of venture capital. The valley of death will burn a lot more money, but in service of jacking up the revenue curve. And the camel approach is taking the opposite, saying, hey, look, like we can still take venture capital, we can still do that, but let's have the flexibility of controlling our own destiny a little bit more. And that might actually mean that you're losing a little bit of that inflection curve. So that might be the cost. An example I actually love in the US is the case of Grubhub. So I often think of on-demand delivery as one of these incredibly profligate categories, right? Like think of DoorDash, it's raised over $1.5 billion. And yet when I interviewed Mike Evans, the COO and co-founder of the business, he talked about how at every single fundraise, they were profitable. And every single fundraise was for a very specific purpose. It was to expand to another city or make a small acquisition or whatever. And I asked him, look, it took you 10 years to IPO. Why didn't you just raise a little bit more money? And he said, I could have done it in 8, but I would have done so at tremendously more risk. And so that's really the point I'm trying to make. In Grubhub's case, by the way, their valley of death looked more like a bunch of, I called it ditches of death, but rhythmic, they went back into this investment cycle. Another story that I like a lot is the story of Qualtrics, which is a Utah-based company. And when I interviewed Ryan, the CEO, he talked a lot about the fact that being a camel was a big driver to their ability to have their big success. So they at the beginning started as a university software quiz business, like feedback and surveys and things like that. And it wasn't until year 12 that they had their big pivot into enterprise, which is they started making money. And they later on raised money from Excel and a couple other VCs that are over 2 billion. They sold for 8 billion to SAP, but really attributed this to the fact that they really built a business on a strong foundation. I think that there's a risk in the Valley and frankly all over the world to look at business models that have been growth at all cost and then look at the result and say, well, look, they're a multi-billion-dollar business. How did they do it? And then you look back and you say, well, this is how they did it. They did it with unsustainable unit economics, whatever. I think the challenge with that is that we only know one iteration of that story. And if you replay that story 100 times, how many times would we get that outcome? And I believe it's not that many times, right? Those things happen in one very particular time and context that happens to be Silicon Valley today and a gigantic boom in the economy, blah, blah, blah. And I think that if you replay the camel story 100 times, you get many more outcomes of success. And so that's really what I'm trying to think about is how do you get better risk-adjusted outcomes that are better for the entrepreneurs, the VCs, everyone in the ecosystem.
Right. We're seeing the result of success bias. We only hear about the ones that made it, not all the thousands that died in the way. Now, similar story, one of the things that hit me with your book was, this notion of innovation as the same as disruption, right? And I think your insight that really got to me was like, well, that works perfect in mature economies where there is something to disrupt.
Yeah.
So tell us, and you say that innovators outside of Silicon Valley need to be creators. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, so first, what is disruption? Disruption was a term that was invented by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School, not about the software industry at all. It was about, at the beginning, he was researching the steel industry where there were these big integrated steel mills that made all the steel. And then at the low end of the market where the integrated steel mills couldn't serve, right, small projects, things like that, there were these little mini mills that started popping up. And then mini mills got better at that and then took the next slice of the market and eventually conquered the whole market, right? So that's the original story of market disruption, of taking a inefficient incumbent and replacing it with a small, nimble, technologically driven disruptor, and often entrepreneur driven. And this is modern day David and Goliath story that's really emotionally appealing. And that, that story has really shaped not just how we think about innovation, but problem selection in Silicon Valley, where we look for, and I'm using the royal we here, but the Valley looks for problems that have an inefficient solution with a proven market and an incumbent solution by and large, and tries to solve it with software. But in many emerging markets, I think that entrepreneurs don't have that, quote, luxury. And I actually think they do something more important. I call it creators, where they're solving a market need with a product or service that was previously not available in the formal economy. They're doing it often for the mass market, and they're often the shoulders of giants upon which others build in the future. If you look at the industry composition of the biggest companies in the Valley, less than 20% of unicorns are in things like fintech, financial services, healthcare, education, agriculture, climate change, what have you. In emerging markets, the numbers are flipped. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, it's well over 60%, right? And so there's a really big shift towards not just the problem selection and industry selection, but how the products are solved. And so I think that's an important mindset. And by the way, I'm actually hopeful that coming out of COVID, one of the things we're going to see is a shift back to creators. I think COVID has shown a light on the world on a lot of these problems that are not new. Like in the US, for instance, it's not new that 60 million Americans that are underbanked, or 85 million Americans that don't have access to healthcare. But I think that we're shining a light on it and saying, oh man, these are large, intractable problems that we could potentially solve with digital innovation, technological and business model shifts. And they're pretty big markets. I'm hoping that what we'll see is lessons from the best entrepreneurs around the world of taking this creator's lens and that being applied to solving big problems everywhere, including here.
Right, and many times these creators, when they're tackling big problems, they quickly find out that it's not just the original problem that they're trying to solve that they need to concentrate on, but many times they have to build what we call the full stack. You have to build an infrastructure around it, like, or around. I think you gave an example of fintech company in Brazil.
Guiabolso, yeah, and this is another example of having to do more with less. And Guiabolso, I think, is a really fun example. So Guiabolso is a personal finance manager. Imagine one app, and you can see all your financial accounts in there. There are a bunch of companies like this in the US. Mint.com is one of the more famous ones that was bought by Intuit. And if you wanted to build a Mint.com in the US, you build the app. If you want to connect to people's bank accounts, well, that infrastructure exists. There are a bunch of bank interconnection layer softwares like Yodlee or Plaid and others. If you want to offer people financial products like credit, like a new credit card or whatever to monetize, well, there is a FICO score that's pretty applicable across the country. And then there are a bunch of fintechs and even just incumbents that are willing to buy digital leads. And so you have to just really build the app. In Brazil, Guiabolso had to do the whole thing. So what I call the vertical stack. So they built the app, but they couldn't connect to the banks. There wasn't a bank interconnection layer. And so they had to build it themselves. And then they wanted to offer products and services. Well, there wasn't a very comprehensive credit score across the country. There's a blacklist. You're either on it or you're not. And that isn't really insightful into the credit worthiness of someone. And so they had to build a Credit Karma, which is another kind of company in the US, but that kind of interface around giving insights around credit worthiness. And then they had to convince people to lend to their customer base. And so they actually had to kickstart that marketplace. So they built 4 businesses just to build the one. And so that obviously is way more painful, right? But the advantage, I believe, is that when you look at the end of the road on some of these businesses, they're much harder to then displace. Because if someone else wants to come in, they have to do a bunch of these things as well. And by the way, Guiabolso has now raised a bunch of capital from a bunch of the leading investors, and it's gonna be harder for someone else to raise capital from those VCs too, in a world where VC is constrained. And so you end up having a harder mountain to climb, but once you're at the top, you kind of have a natural fortification a little bit. And so that's one of the at least bright sides to that story a little bit. So that's what I mean by the full stack, and most often it's a vertical one. The other thing I've seen a lot in emerging markets is a propensity to much earlier in the journey build the horizontal ecosystem, the horizontal stack of saying, hey, look, there's so many needs out there, and there's so much customer education and difficulty in acquisition, et cetera, that very early you end up being forced into building an ecosystem. And so one example there is a company called Gojek in Indonesia, which is a ride-sharing company. But unlike Uber and Lyft or Didi in China, when I spoke to Nadeem, his vision for how to do it, and Nadeem's the founder, he talked a lot about, in the morning I want to drive people to work. At lunch, I'm going to deliver food. In the afternoon, I'll drive them home. In the evening, I'll deliver food. Throughout the day, I'll deliver e-commerce packages, financial services, doctor visits, et cetera, right? Really build this horizontal ecosystem to think about the driver throughout the day, but also the needs of his customers across a broad array of vectors. And that's, I think, emblematic of what we see. And he did that transition much earlier in the journey than you might have seen other companies, right? It's natural for people to cross-sell eventually, but you end up seeing that much earlier in the journey in emerging markets. So anyways, I'll pause there, but that's how I think about the full stack.
Yeah, and Ryan reminds me a little bit about the shift I've seen in Latin America first of like trying to emulate Silicon Valley by having an app that's very specific and does one thing really well. And now it seems like people are waking up to the mega app model coming out of China and Asia.
And the other thing, and so the super app, there's certainly a lot of people across a lot of different vectors that are trying to build super apps. And by the way, what's interesting is those models are now coming back to the Valley, and a lot of people in the Valley are also trying to build super apps. But actually, that's the bit that I think is most interesting, is that it used to be that people would look to innovation in the Valley for ideas, and then those would then get copied and all over the world. And that, I think, is no longer the case. I think now the best ideas are increasingly coming from everywhere and being adapted in local markets, but also getting improved in local markets. So, the Gojek idea is an example, that happened to be an idea that came from the Valley. It was adapted in Indonesia. And by the way, the things that Gojek is doing, like food delivery and financial services, like it's no surprise that Uber is now their biggest category is Uber Eats, and growing category is Uber Eats, and they're doing an Uber credit card, et cetera. So these ideas improve as they get localized. But the other thing that's actually happening that's most exciting is that the best ideas, and particularly in emerging markets, are also coming from emerging markets and getting scaled. There's a business called Udaan in India that is SMB services. It's one of the fastest to being a multi-billion-dollar company. I think it was 3-4 years to be a $3 billion business in India. There are now Udaans in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and I'm sure there's going to be some coming to LATAM soon. We were investors in the firm I work at in a company called Pinduoduo in China, which was like a 5 year to, it's a $100 billion business today on publicly traded around social commerce. There are now PDDs all over the world, like local adaptations of that model. And the model can't be copy pasted either, because some of these things depend on local infrastructure that exists. But I think we're going to see more and more of that, of some of the best ideas coming from other places where, frankly, this is one of those examples where I think that an entrepreneur in LATAM has more in common with an entrepreneur in India. And so the business models that emerge and succeed in India might actually have more relevance to learn from and reflect on. And obviously very, very different contexts as well. And so need to be reflected on. It can't be copy-based, but we'll see more of that trends.
Perfect. Another big theme in your book is around team building versus hiring A players, right? The mantra out of Silicon Valley is only hire the best, only hire A players. That's not always, again, going back to the need of building the full stack.
Yeah.
It works also internally in your operations. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in the Valley, so first, every aspect of company building that is best practice and innovation is rooted in the context of the Valley. And in the Valley, there's an ocean of talent and of like a lot of been there, done that, startup executives, the whole way down, programmers, marketing, et cetera. And so in that context, things like employee churn are easily solvable. It's okay for Uber to have average 13-month tenure, because if someone leaves, there's tons of other very qualified people that could take that job and come in. And so churn and things like that are built into the system, but built into the context that they operate in. But in many startup ecosystems around the world, the depth of been there, done that startup talent is just not there, right? Think of my hometown, Winnipeg. If I was looking for a CMO, there aren't 500 people the way there might be in the Valley. There might not be 50. There's probably more like 5, and they're probably working at my competitors. And so by nature, the way I would think about how I would recruit that person, and if I got that person in the seat, how I would think of holding on to them for dear life if they were good as they scale, right? Like that mentality ends up shifting. And so what you see is different approaches across the recruiting and human capital spectrum. I'll talk about one which is very topical today, which is distributed teams. You know, with COVID, we've all been forced, pendulum swing, to go to 100% remote. And that's been obviously a big shock. But what's interesting is if you look at the best companies, the biggest companies across emerging startup ecosystems, distributed teams have been part of that DNA for a long time. Maybe not fully remote, but multiple offices, tech teams in different parts of the world, a sales team, a fundraising team in different places. Like those kind of things are pretty common. And so when the world shifted to COVID and shifting to remote work, in the US, for instance, it's no surprise that the best companies in the world, in the US at least, are doing remote, were companies like Basecamp out of Chicago or Zapier out of Missouri that had to do this not just because in those cases a philosophical approach to company building, but also because of sheer practicality that was the only way to do it to be able to attract talent. And so distributed teams, for me, by the way, I think that this is a long-term trend, and this will be best practice in building. So one of the companies I backed is a company called Terminal that actually helps US companies scale teams across LATAM and North America in remote. I think this is a long-term trend, but I also think the pendulum has probably swung so far in one direction. We'll see it balance out. But I think this is an area where adversity caused a different strategy in emerging startup ecosystem. And that different strategy, by the way, turns into an advantage. Turns into an advantage in a time like COVID to build more resiliency. It turns into an advantage if you need to be multi-market pretty early in the journey and you already have built-in DNA of working remotely across different cultures. It turns into a variety of these manifested advantages, despite the fact that it's harder in the beginning to implement.
Right, and you also mentioned in the book distributed, but also the need to also set up your own like training programs as you scale.
Yeah.
To make sure that you have the right influx of people and human capital, when you need it.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And really the strategies and the rethinking has to happen across every vector of the human capital journey, right? On how you source, and that might be strategies like distributed. I talk about others, how you retain, how you grow, et cetera. And what you're alluding to, I think is really interesting. I think Shopify is a really extreme example of this, where Shopify, which is a big e-commerce company that started in Ottawa in Canada, was finding that it was tapping completely the local talent market. And there wasn't enough people that were strong engineers or what have you to be able to fill the ranks of their growing company. And so, they're perhaps an extreme example of building the talent pipeline themselves, but there's a bunch of other more tactical ones that smaller companies can do too. But they partnered with a university and launched a dedicated Shopify degree, a dev degree, where people would take classes. But in Canada, there's a pretty common thing called a co-op program where you work also at the company at the same time as doing classes, so like a co-op program. And then at the end of the degree, they would have a job offer from Shopify, one of the top e-commerce top tech companies in the world, for 2 years. And if they stayed, the whole degree would be free, type thing. And by the way, that also drives a lot of other advantages like diversity. Half the class was female. They had a much better minority representation. They were able to solve some of these systemic issues in tech, in part by taking a concerted approach at building the pipeline. And the result has ended up being pretty positive. It's very early, but I think we're seeing more and more of those kind of things.
Yeah, that resonated with me a lot because, you know, having been an entrepreneur first and having had to hire teams and now shifting into venture capital, I find myself sort of trying to solve the same issues, but for more companies now. And so that's part of the reason why, besides just being a venture capital firm, I think we also have this very strong, we're actually grew out sort of as a ecosystem builder, you know, with Venture Hub, and you saw we're bringing Holberton to Ecuador to sort of solve one of those issues that a lot of our companies and all the other startup companies in Ecuador face when trying to hire talent. Talk a little bit more about how the VC model also has had to innovate outside of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and you know, first a quick retrospective, which is where did the VC model come from, right? I often ask my students, I say, where do you think the VC model originates? And they often say, oh, it's definitely invented in Silicon Valley. The reality is the roots are much older. They come from a different industry, the whaling industry. And back in the day, this massive industry, 70% of the market share globally was one country, it was the United States, and 70% of that was from one small little town called New Bedford. And the reason New Bedford was the dominant force globally of the whaling industry was because they had invented a financing mechanism to be able to distribute risk in high risk ventures. So essentially the merchants, or modern day VCs, got capital from investors, they built a portfolio, they funded captains who were our modern day entrepreneurs, who got a share of the proceeds, who hired crew, and the crew only got paid with what the boat came in, kind of like stock options. And the reason it's carried interest today was it used to be literally what you carried off the boat. That model has worked extraordinarily well in the Valley for a very particular type of company. But as the VC and entrepreneurship model continues to globalize, there's 480 startup ecosystems around the world. There's over 1 million venture-backed startups. I don't think this one size fits all is going to continue to work. And so there are some adaptations starting to play out in the venture model around the world. And so some of the things that are happening, for instance, is we're seeing one, looking to other industries for inspiration on how you might structure investing. And so another high risk industry is the mining industry. And in the mining industry, royalty models is the norm. And so we're actually seeing some interesting plays around revenue shares. There's a company in Brazil called A55 that does revenue share financing for companies. It looks a little bit like how Clearbank does it in Canada. So we're seeing outside of the Valley these interesting approaches emerging. Or two, rethinking the duration of the fund. So instead of having a 10-year fund, maybe an evergreen fund, to have a longer duration to match the fact that, you know, exits are harder. Or the rise of different players, like corporates in China, who are really using their ecosystem to accelerate a company, not just investing, but really accelerating, or the rise of impact investors, or even users themselves. I think we're going to see more of those kind of adaptations. It's still very, very early days. But I think by the time I write my sequel, we'll have some better examples.
Perfect. With that, I'm going to see if we can open it up to at least one question from the audience, and then we need to wrap up. Pame?
Ok, chévere. Muchísimas gracias, Alexander y Fernando. Ahora, bueno, vamos a pasar las preguntas. Voy a explicar súper rápido para que nos dé el tiempo. Vamos a tener nuevas reglas por cómo se van a manejar las preguntas porque no tenemos activado el chat. Lo que vamos a hacer es que si que tienen una pregunta, en este momento alcen la mano. ¿Cómo hacen eso? Cuando hacen clic en participantes, les va a aparecer en su lado derecho todos los participantes, y si es que ponen en more o más, les va a salir raise hand, o seguro ya les sale ahí sin poner more. Entonces levantan la mano y nosotros lo que vamos a hacer es desactivar en este momento su micrófono para que ustedes puedan hacer la pregunta. Pero tenemos reglas importantes a seguir para que esto no se salga de control. Por favor, solamente una pregunta. Vas a tener 1 minuto para hacer la pregunta. Es una pregunta, no un comentario, ni tampoco un pitch ni nada por el estilo. Solo una pregunta. Y en el momento en el que termines de hacer la pregunta, te vamos a desactivar el micrófono nuevamente. Te pedimos también, por favor, para que lo podamos manejar de manera más fluida, que la pregunta la puedas hacer en inglés. Entonces, bueno, con eso en mente, por favor, comiencen a levantar la mano, y Carmen, me avisas cuando ya podamos desactivar el micrófono a la persona que esté levantando.
Perfecto. Creo que por el tiempo vamos a alcanzar una, máximo dos. Entonces, si es que alguien quiere hacerle una pregunta a Alex, y si no, sé que Fernando tiene una más que se le quedó fuera. Entonces, si no hay preguntas del público, vamos a regresar a Fernando. Y Alex, I just want to make sure I thank you for being here. It was a marvelous talk, and I really enjoyed your presentation and your chat with Fernando.
My pleasure, and happy to answer any questions. If it's an easy one, I'll take it. If it's a hard one, I'll punt it to Fernando.
Okay, I have one question here from Andres Rodriguez. I've already unmuted you, Andres.
All right, thank you so much.
Here you go.
Carmen and Alex, I appreciate all your insights, very insightful conversation, rundown of the global ecosystem. I want to ask you, what do you think are the industries or type of startups that will have a momentum post-COVID times, globally or specifically in Latin America or emerging markets in general?
Yeah, and this alludes back to the point I was making a little bit earlier. I'm very hopeful that what we'll see coming out of COVID is a focus on creators and building industries where there are really big market gaps. And so very tactically, fintech has been a really big industry in emerging markets and there are now some really big success stories. I think that wave we're only on the second or third inning. I think that wave is still going to continue to play out. I'm spending a lot of time in healthcare and health tech, and I think there's some really interesting things that were not possible before that are possible. Questions of future work and how you collaborate as well. Within future work, I actually think questions of retraining and things like that are fascinating. And in emerging markets, we might see a rise of ed tech, but there's historically not been that many massive ed tech exits in the US. But we're seeing some really big businesses, really interesting businesses getting built in emerging markets, Baiju in India. I think we're going to see, to fill some of these gaps / give kind of smaller training, cheaper training, whatever, to disrupt this place. I think we're going to see some really interesting plays there. So I'm looking personally at the intersection of technology and tech for good type of questions. I think we're going to continue seeing some momentum there.
Great. Well, Alex, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a great pleasure for me. I've been wanting to talk to you like this ever since I read your book. For everyone who hasn't read the book yet, I highly recommend it. I think it'll solidify a lot of things that are whirling around your minds and brains right now. So thank you again. And with that, I leave it to Pame.
Thank you so much for having me. And hopefully next time we'll be able to do this in person. Ecuador is a special place in my heart. My wife and I got engaged in Ecuador. And so hopefully we'll be able to come back and visit soon. And for those interested, you can find the book anywhere where books are sold, but I encourage you to support your local bookstores, or you can follow me on, you sign up for my newsletter if you're interested at alexlazarow.com. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure having you. We hope to have you in person and take you out for some fun here in Ecuador.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.